Jesus freak here. Over the years, I've started to learn a few things about various churches. And it's why, honestly, I'm glad that I stayed within the system rather than, seeking out new experiences. Which, I mean, I have. But the way to identify, the best way to identify a counterfeit is to familiarize yourself with the real thing. The first thing I learned, and I still learn this as a kid, was that a lot of bigger churches, and pretty much every megachurch, ceases to be a temple to God and becomes a monument to a charismatic leader. I don't think I've seen too many megachurches survive more than one generation. Once the charismatic leader's on, the church burns out. Another thing I noticed is that they operate outside of any sort of a framework. They're independent. Most of them are. There are large churches that are affiliated with denominations. Most of them aren't this type of church. You can have smaller churches that fall into this trap too. But when you have anti-denominationalism, you often have the pastors placed on a pedestal. You have the Moses method. You have the idea that the leader of the church, and sometimes he might reject the word pastor or any biblical terms because, they think they're above that. They think they're answerable only to God. Now, there's a reason that hierarchy, which means, it's, in its most literal sense, it's the structure of church, of holy governance, so to speak. But it's gotten sort of an extension. But that's because, like, churches and stuff traditionally been hierarchical. And there's a good reason for that. It's because there's accountability. When your pastor's only accountable to God and not to anyone else, then he's basically a king. Positions of power. We say power corrupts. Really what it is positions of power attract the corruptible and the already corrupt. And this happens a lot in churches. This happens especially in independent churches. You have different problems with Rome. This isn't about that. But independent churches with no oversight, the pastor becomes a sort of a small king. Often. I mean, this isn't always the case, but it often happens. and becomes a petty tyrant. Another thing I've noticed is that independent churches almost always fall into two specific categories, either Baptist or Pentecostal. Most of them are Pentecostal. Say what you want about Pentecostalism, but independent Pentecostalism sometimes branches out into even weirder stuff. And this is where you get stuff like the New Apostolic Reformation, which is basically the 20th and 21st century version of Mormonism. Restorationism, new apostles, new prophets, new revelation, which of course means denying the inerrancy of Scripture and its completeness. If all Scripture is given by inspiration of God is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. This Scripture is, if perfected by Scripture, Scripture is complete, self-contained, and self-sufficient. And in stuff like the New Apostolic Reformation, this idea is denied. A lot of these types seem to take the idea from the Puritans of America being sort of new Israel, and they really play this up. And they place God as someone who seems to have an unusual focus specifically on the United States, ignoring the rest of the world. Who seems to have a habit of speaking in a Jacobean English, even though nobody's spoken that way for 400 years. Who frequently sends out storms and then lets them go so far out of control that instead of hitting their intended target, they completely backfire. A small, petty, impotent God. And often you start finding them branching out into some really corrupt stuff. Not that this doesn't happen in the smaller churches. I went to a very small church when I was young. They had copies of Plus magazine all over the back of the sanctuary. Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, which is the New Thought. And the New Thought is a bunch of late 19th century mumbo jumbo. I mean, it passes itself off as Christianity, the way the devil passes himself off as an angel of light, as Scripture says. You know, I've been saying this recently. Your best inoculation, your best vaccine against false Christian doctrine is the Bible. Now, I'm trying to, sort of root out some clips here. Although I'm sure, Long for Truth, the Messed Up Church can do so much better than I could. A lot of these ideas that come from the New Thought, it's the same old yea hath God said. The first heresy in Scripture is when the devil convinced Adam and Eve that they could be like God. They could be his equal. And throughout history, people have tried to make themselves equal to God. And the New Thought, you might recognize a lot of these ideas because they've infected the church so thoroughly. The idea that there's a little bit of Christ in all of you, that you can unlock this Christness and perform signs and wonders, that you can sort of speak the world into obeying your will. I decree and declare! This is why you'll notice people who are involved with the New Thought often don't pray so much as they attempt to manifest. They're like, I declare that I am this and that, instead of, Lord, if this is your will, give me this. This is all the New Thought, but it's all the yea hath God said. And pretty much every one of these independent, large preachers is going to be pushing this. The New Apostolic Reformation pushes it. It's all about whizbang. It's all about I, me, mine. Yes, I know where that phrase I, me, mine comes from. I don't care. Christianity is not and never was about I, me, mine. It's about you, him, her, them. And we're a faith of faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. But people, they want signs and wonders. They want whiz-bang. They want to see. You don't need to see. When doubting Thomas, he said, I'm not going to believe until I see. And Jesus said, you see and you believe. But it's more blessed to believe without having to see. We're a faith of faith. We're not about whizbang. We don't need whizbang. And all it does is misdirect us. So I'm trying to get that out there. The new Apostolic Reformation is using a phony Christianity to seek power. And it's going to be hard, not because, because I don't know all this, but because I got to prove it, because I got to dig up the proof. You know, it's like writing an essay, and that's where I failed in school. Jesus freak out.